Welcome to the Future of Payroll and Workforce Management Insights by HR.com, your go-to resource for insights into payroll and workforce management. From navigating compliance and technology trends to exploring the latest in global payroll solutions, we're here to keep you ahead of the curve. Join us as we dive into the forces reshaping payroll and share practical strategies to optimize your workforce management. Let's get started. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Future Payroll and Workforce Management, a podcast here at HR.com, where I am your host. My name is Brent Skinner, and you've probably seen me on other episodes as well, since this is my podcast. But in any event, this is about my guest, Brad Collins, who is fractional CFO, and he does some of that work for datascalehr. HR. Welcome, Brad.
Thanks, Brent. Appreciate you having me on.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks for agreeing to be on the podcast. We have a really, really interesting topic today, just to sort of clue our audience into what it's all about. We have a working title, and I think we might keep this. Could payroll's eventual future reside in the CFO suite? And by default. So a little bit of intrigue there, a little bit of debate. Looking forward to getting into some of that controversy and some of the interesting stuff. But before we do that, I like to ask all my guests, what got you into this industry? And maybe, Brad, what also got you into finance? There's a lot of passion in this space. So always great stories to hear.
Yeah. Thank you. Look, my sort of first roles in my career were all in finance. So I sort of came up through finance and then found my way into HR and payroll via my role with Velocity Global, which was one of the pioneers in the employer of record space. And so, developed a unique passion for the space during that time, which was about 5 years. And since then, I've stayed in the space. So yes, working with a company like datascalehr, solving for global payroll connectivity, which I think we'll talk about more today because it is at the unique intersection of payroll and finance, and something that I care deeply about, which is being able to use that data for decision making and making sure that you can stave off payroll issues and things like that by having data flows that are working for you instead of against you.
Yeah, really interesting, really interesting. And I actually had Datascale HR's co-founder, Jerome Gouvernel. He was on this podcast last year around this time, actually.
Yeah.
And we had a really interesting conversation around AI and payroll. And that's not what we're going to be talking about today, but just to give folks just kind of clue them into what Datascale HR is all about. So let's get into it. So there's been some infusion of cash. I guess that's a sort of an understatement. Been billions of dollars sort of invested into by some fintech players into the idea of bundling payroll with other applications that are sort of perennially sort of CFO suite types of stuff, like bill pay and these kinds of things, bundling them together and offering them to small businesses right at the outset when maybe they need to solve for payroll because they've been doing it sort of manually or whatever. And before we get into some of the questions that we have here that we want to address today, what do you think of that? What does that say, Brad? What do you think of that whole sort of investment thing happening right now?
Yeah, look, I think it's a very interesting trend. It's definitely happening to the tune of the magnitude that you mentioned, right? I think for me, and again, my perspective comes from working closely with early stage companies. Like at the early stage, it's about growth. Using your data for decision making. Reporting to investors if you have them, and so yeah, naturally, payroll comes into that because your payroll data is critical, right? It's a huge piece of your spend. You need to have some control over it, and you need it to come in for reporting. And so, somebody like me, fractional CFO, coming in early, I'm usually the one that's kind of building the initial systems and setting them up. And so, I'm not all that surprised to see companies like, Mercury and Payoneer and companies like Tide in the UK kind of getting into the space where it's not just your business bank account anymore. It's your payroll too.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that, right? You're right. A fractional CFO might be coming in a lot of these situations and be sort of tasked with solving for all of these sort of money outgoing sort of things, and payroll being one of them, right? And so
Yeah.
it sort of naturally gravitates. Um, are we? So here, let me set the stage a little bit here, right? Because there's this debate. I've kind of danced around this. I should have maybe mentioned this earlier, but in any event, there's a debate among payroll leaders, right? It's kind of it's a there's some passion around it, right? Should we cohabitate with HR or with finance, right? Because at least in North America, it seems to be, I don't think it's exactly 50-50 or anything really is, but there's quite a fair share that are under finance versus HR. So it's a good sort of distribution there. Um, and a lot of payroll leaders are like, hey, we really think that we should cohabitate with HR, right? We should live with HR, not finance, right? And I've actually also spoken with payroll leaders who said, you know what, we shouldn't be reporting to either of them. We should be our own thing, and that's also something that's happening in the space of chief payroll officer movement and all that. But when you think about small businesses, right, and this is kind of me backing into this question that we have, right, that we want to address today, is when you think of small businesses, they're first trying to solve for this. Then maybe they had an accidental HR person or somebody like you said, maybe it's the founder who's just gotten to the point where, hey, I just can't process payroll every 2 weeks, right?
Yeah.
And do everything else. And so they're sort of crying uncle, as the old saying goes, right? And they're just looking to solve just to get it off their plate. And to me, that seems kind of like, that cost center mentality that we hear about, that a
Mhm.
lot of payroll departments themselves are trying to get out of. So are we seeing sort of a ground up shift where payroll is born into finance rather than HR, in that regard? And what might that signal for the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. A lot to unpack there. Uh,
Sure.
I will say, look, the people aspects of payroll, right? I mean, I'm not going to say that the finance folks are not, people friendly and employee experience friendly by any means, but you know, there are questions that come up, right? And as a fractional CFO, I get these questions if I'm in that seat, right? Like, hey, how do I change? How do I resubmit my W-4? Right. Um,
Yeah.
and those are things that happen even in small businesses all the time, right? But then as you grow, the complexities are even bigger. It's, leave of absences and, maybe even unique pay elements like wage garnishments and things like that are, you know, you are more at the intersection of HR and payroll at that point, and having to take care of those matters. And so um, there is that piece, but there's also the strategic use of payroll data in the business, which is what I deeply care about as a finance person. And so, um, you know, I try to separate the strategic use of data from the function itself, right? And so, when I'm looking at it, it's through that lens. And, I think we could talk more about what that means for the future and how people could maybe set themselves up on both sides of the table for that future. But that's kind of the lens that I'm looking at it through.
Yeah. That's a really good point. And it kind of gets into another sort of implication of all this, right? Because we've heard, for a long time, and it's not HR's fault, and it's getting better, but the data in HR, like around the employee life cycle, it's it's kind of unintegrated. There's different data sets. Some of it's unstructured. Not all of it feeds into payroll, obviously, right? But there's sort of a hodgepodge there, and necessarily clean and in order, whereas finance's data set is typically in better shape because of reporting rigor and all this kind of stuff, right? Um, and when we hear about bringing it back to payroll, one of the things that I'm hearing all the time, and I'm certainly not the only one in this space, is that in order to be strategic with with payroll, well, let me put it this way. I had somebody on the podcast about a year ago, and this was the topic of the title of the episode was, what does it mean for payroll to be strategic? Because we hear it all the time. So it sounds cool. Yeah, I want that. I want to aspire to that. But what does it actually mean? And it always comes back to, well, if you have access to this data that's just so important to the organization, to decision making. So again, in a long-winded way, and forgive me, but is payroll maybe in a better spot living with finance maybe as a function because of the data integrity if it wants to become strategic?
I think so. I mean, there's two things, right? Well, one thing is almost, seemingly basic, right? And you brought it up, like the HCM systems, right? A lot of times the HR team will choose an HCM system that has an integrated payroll, and maybe the data coming out of that flows into the ERP system isn't that great, right? Maybe it's not at a department level, right? Or maybe when people change roles, those things aren't getting updated in one or both of the systems, right? And so all of a sudden, my ability to track different cost centers in the business and do analysis breaks down really quickly, right? Payroll is in a unique position to help, you know, prevent those issues, right? And then I would say the other thing, and this is more of a macro factor like right now, right? Is there's just a huge focus on human capital spend and AI spend, digital labor, right? Everybody's focused on the ROI metrics around that and how to look at the ROI around those spend categories. And I actually think if you're a payroll data analyst, you're in payroll, you're actually in a pretty unique position to help analyze that data and provide insights to the business and to investors because you just have a deep understanding, especially if you're across multiple countries, where that data is, how to get it, how to look at it, how to maybe compare it against digital spend. So, yeah, I think there's a really interesting opportunity. Now, again, does that mean they have to be in finance to do that? Or can they be over in HR? I don't necessarily know, but like that is that when you're getting into that realm, you're definitely getting into more um, touching finance processes and systems and ways of thinking.
You know what? Um, yes, and such a great point around the AI agents and the investment in that and the sort of that whole thing, right? But but I think what we're getting to here is speed, right? So if payroll is obviously there's information that's the tributaries to payroll just by design. They come from the HCM side of things, right? From the workforce management system and all this kind of stuff, right? But if you have if you're just struggling to get all that data as a payroll department, you're spending all your time doing that because you're sort of affiliated with or sort of hooked up on the HR side as primarily as opposed on the finance side, then you're spending all your time trying to gather that information, and you don't have the mental white space or the actual time to make sense of it and present it to leadership so that it can be seen in time. So I said time a bunch of times there, but in time to actually act on it, if for leadership to even realize that it's information that they could use.
Great point. Again, I think that does come back to business evolution a bit, right? And my lens being, really that earlier stage business. I can't. The businesses that I work with, don't have the luxury of large teams like that. But when you do get into the enterprise, right, you do find that they have more robust HR and payroll teams. And so, you know, why can't the payroll team both do that front end data collection, clean up as needed, and then have a payroll data analyst, right? Maybe, to me, that's no different than how I would maybe structure a business intelligence and analytics team in a business. And I would, you know, parachute in analysts, or have each team have their own data analyst um, that sort of sits in there, does analysis for the team itself, and then helps also with the collective centralized reporting, right? So maybe that's more of a modern approach to structuring the payroll team in a larger enterprise.
I actually have speaking of the enterprise and then the other end of the spectrum, obviously, which is the small businesses we're talking about. Do you think that, I mean, the entire premise, keep us honest here. This idea that small businesses are getting payroll bundled in with other finance applications, right?
Yeah.
Does that necessarily, is that a canary in the coal mine? Does it necessarily bode that it's going to stay that way as a company grows, or are they locked in? Is that sort of a point of no return, or are these companies just way too flexible, and sure they can make a switch later on?
I think for most of and especially for maybe even some of the companies that we mentioned earlier, right? I mean, and me as a fractional CFO, right? Like I really don't intend for these systems to be there, beyond a certain size point. And I would fully, one, appreciate and two, expect somebody that has the deeper domain expertise to come in and replace these with, best of breed systems eventually. And it's these SMB focused tools are really great. And, some of them I will say focus a little bit more too much on the UI, right? But like, integration quality is critical. And then eventually you are going to run into edge cases that these payroll systems were not built to handle, right? And then you will have to go to something more robust. So in 10 years from now, could some of them evolve into much more robust systems? Definitely possible. Today, um, from my perspective, they would likely cap out at a certain size level and you'd have to make a switch.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Maybe from a cultural standpoint, though, right? I think that's maybe what I was trying to get at, is from a cultural standpoint, it might be that business from an early stage in its growth just got accustomed to the idea that payroll should live with finance. Um,
Yeah.
if that's the case, then, how should HR and payroll leaders maybe respond today to this possible sort of cultural shift in terms, or a, we'll call it cultural shift, I guess, in terms of where payroll should end up?
Yeah, I mean, you're probably right, and I do think, from a cultural people standpoint, it's most likely that payroll and HR is going to, for early stage companies, probably is going to stay there longer, with the finance team, maybe than it has in the past. But I would say if you're already set up and you're already operating in one modality, then I mean the focus for you today would just be partnership. Again, like I've kind of brought up some of the gaps that I typically see, um, but if you are a payroll person sitting in HR, go talk to your finance ops team, find out what data they need that they're not getting. If there's a gap, like be a part of helping them close that gap, right? Um, so those are, it seems somewhat trivial and maybe basic, but that's what I would do now to start, bridging those gaps and building the partnership.
Yeah. Maybe there's even an opportunity for finance to learn a little bit more about what HR leadership is about, and maybe to everybody can kind of understand each other a little bit more, and bridge this, at least this divide that seems to be, people seem to talk about it still, that people outcomes versus, some of the more finance related stuff. It's all very interesting to think about.
Yeah,
And
I would
yeah,
agree. I would
yeah,
agree.
yeah. Sorry, I talked over you there. Brad, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast. This was a really, really interesting episode. I'm glad we had an opportunity to discuss it.
Yeah, likewise, Brent. I appreciate you bringing this subject up with me. It's again like near and dear to me, and I find it very interesting to kind of look at it from this perspective. Um, Obviously, given all of the deals that have been happening in the space, so yeah, I think it's a pertinent topic, and appreciate you bringing me in on it.
Thanks for tuning in to the Future of Workforce Management and Payroll Insights by HR.com. We hope today's episode brought you valuable insights and fresh perspectives on the future of payroll and workforce management. Be sure to check out more episodes and explore resources at HR.com/podcast or wherever you listen to podcasts. Until next time, keep innovating and making a difference in the world of payroll and workforce management.